Welcome back to Higher Change. We are on Chapter 19, How We Learn Habits and Hangups. In this lesson, we're going to talk about behavioral learning. Humans are constantly learning, as learning is about more than an acquisition of facts and information. Behaviors are often learned from our environment, whether that is through involuntary or voluntary conditioning. So in this lesson, you will differentiate between classical and operant conditioning. You'll describe how classical and operant conditioning works. You'll identify applications or examples of the different kinds of conditioning. You'll give an example of aversive conditioning. We'll also discuss the pros and cons of punishment. And lastly, we'll be able to describe how we learn from others through observational learning. So let's start with a brief overview. What is, first of all, the definition of learning? Learning is any relatively permanent change in behavior brought about by experience or practice. It's the process that allows us to adapt to the changing conditions in the environment. So just to break this down a little, learning is relatively permanent. That means if you forgot it the next day, then you didn't really learn something. On the other hand, it's relatively permanent. That's because we can forget things over time. Now, learning is through practice or by experience, especially behaviors. We learn our behaviors through either practice or by experience. And so musicians and artists, they may, and athletes, they may practice their behaviors so that they get it down right. It's a process that allows us to adapt to the changing conditions of the environment. That's what learning does. So behaviorism is a science that looks at how behaviors are learned through association or conditioning. So that's behaviorism. It's a branch of psychology. Now, there's two types of behavioral learning. There's classical conditioning and there's operant conditioning. But classical conditioning is a type of learning in which an association is learned between an environmental event and a naturally occurring response reflex that follows and becomes associated with the environmental cue. This was first described by Ivan Pavlov. The second one is operant conditioning. This is a type of learning that occurs when an organism is rewarded or punished. Learning is based on gaining rewards and avoiding punishments as the consequences of one's actions. And this was described by B.F. Skinner. So classical conditioning was by Pavlov. Operant conditioning was described by Skinner. Just remember those two key figures. So first of all, what is classical conditioning? Let's go into that in more depth. Classical conditioning is learning that makes a reflex response to a stimulus other than the original natural stimulus that normally produces that reflex. So Ivan Pavlov was a Russian physiologist, a scientist who studies the workings of the body, who discovered one of the simplest forms of learning through his work on digestions in dogs. So what he found was that when a bell was sounding, the dogs would salivate just because they learned to associate the bell with food. So in this case, in the case of salivating dogs, the unconditioned stimulus would be the food, right? Which produced an unconditioned response. In other words, it's a natural stimulus. The food was a natural stimulus, which produced a natural response, which is salivation or the digestion in the stomach. So that's unconditioned because it's natural. Then it was paired with a conditioned stimulus. A stimulus that becomes able to produce a learned reflex response by being paired with the original unconditioned stimulus is called a conditioned stimulus. In other words, so in this case, the bell would be a neutral stimulus. It didn't have a reflex response, but by pairing with the food, it became conditioned. So I like to think of these two keywords. There's natural and neutral. When you pair a natural stimulus with a neutral stimulus, meaning it doesn't have a response, then by pairing them repeatedly, the neutral stimulus becomes conditioned. It becomes a conditioned stimulus. Now, the stimulus generalization is a tendency to respond to a stimulus that is only similar to the original conditioned stimulus with a conditioned response. Stimulus discrimination means learning to respond only to certain stimuli and not to respond to those that are similar. So if we look at the difference, stimulus generalization is the tendency to respond to any stimulus that is just similar to the original conditioned stimulus. A stimulus discrimination means learning to respond only to those stimuli and not those that are similar. So And when we start out with something, we might generalize something, but over time we learn to differentiate between the different types of stimuli. Extinction is the disappearance of a previously learned behavior when the behavior is no longer reinforced or paired with an unconditioned stimulus. The reappearance of a learned response after extinction has occurred is called spontaneous recovery. So extinction is the disappearance, spontaneous recovery is the reoccurrence of something. So an example of this might be like if you learn a language, but over time you forgot it. But in behavioral learning, this would be if, for example, you developed a phobia in response to something because there was a constant repetition of that pairing. But over time, you may learn to differentiate and not associate that. So, for example, if you always thought that a certain type of person was bad because they mistreated you, well, eventually when you encounter different kinds of people, that association will disappear. However, if you have a trigger, if you have that memory triggered where you remember that previous learning, you're going to go back to learning that pretty quick, and that's spontaneous recovery. Same thing with addictions. Sometimes people are addicted to something because they learn that it's associated with pleasure. Now, if you learn to disconnect that, then you might eventually quit the addiction. However, once you become addicted to something, you'll always easily go back to that addiction pretty quick because your brain has a trace or connection that can easily be activated when it relearns something. A type of classical conditioning is aversive conditioning. John Watson demonstrated conditional emotional responses with a little Albert and his learned phobia of white rats. So in that case, if you remember, he conditioned a baby to be afraid of a mouse because he paired the mouse with a loud noise. Aversive conditioning is a type of classical conditioning that is used to create a negative response based on prior conditioning. So in other words, people use this to try to erase or minimize behavior. For example, alcoholics may be prescribed a medication that will cause them to vomit whenever they drink alcohol. And the idea is that this is going to help them reduce or suppress the desire to drink alcohol. People have tried this with sexuality. They've tried to pair sexual images with electroshocks with the hope that it'll reduce a desire. People have tried this for masturbation. But the reality is that aversive conditioning is not as effective for things like sexuality as maybe for creating a phobia, but it doesn't necessarily stop behavior as well as people might have hoped. And it definitely doesn't have an effect on our sexuality as well. But that's just something to know because there has been a lot of controversy about its use in the past. Now, vicarious conditioning, conditioned taste versions, or biological preparedness and stimulus substitutions are all specific examples of classical conditioning that have been discovered since the initial investigations of this type of learning. So let's talk about operant conditioning. We've talked about classical conditioning, which is about involuntary responses, and operant conditioning is about voluntary associations. Operant conditioning is a type of learning more strongly associated with voluntary behavior. A way to remember this is that it sounds like the word operator, as in you're the one driving. So if you think about it, an operator means you're driving. That means you're in voluntary control, and you learn through reinforcement of your actions. So this type of conditioning is based on Edward Thorndike's work with cats in a puzzle box. So he would put cats in a puzzle box, and they would learn how to get out. And once they figured out how to get out, then they would do it again. And the theory is that once they learned how to do it, it was rewarding. The behavior was rewarded, and so they would do it again. And that was a learned response. Thorndike's law of effect is a law that states that if a response is followed by a pleasurable consequence, it tends to be repeated. And if it's followed by an unpleasant consequence, it tends to not be repeated. Now, this may have some inadvertent effects. For example, if a child acts out, but then they get attention from their parents, then they're more likely to act out again because they know that they're going to get attention. So sometimes this law would explain times when we might inadvertently reinforce behavior that we otherwise don't want to. B.F. Skinner expanded on Thorndike's law of effects and coined the term operant conditioning for this type of learning. Any behavior that is voluntary is called operant, as in if you think about you are the operator of your behavior, so therefore it's operant. So let's talk about reinforcement. Reinforcement is the key principle behind operant conditioning. Reinforcement is any event or object that, when following a response, increases the likelihood of that response occurring again. So it's different from classical conditioning because in classical conditioning, the stimulus that motivates behavior is given prior to the action, whereas reinforcement occurs after an action, which then reinforces that response happening again. Primary reinforcers satisfy basic needs and don't need to be learned. So this is kind of like the difference between an unconditioned versus a conditioned stimulus. A primary reinforcer naturally satisfies basic needs, but a secondary reinforcer gets their reinforcing power through prior associations with a primary reinforcer, and thus these are learned. So, for example, giving money to a baby isn't going to mean anything because they don't understand the value of money. But if you give money to an adult, they're going to appreciate it. And that is because of the associations of all the things that come with money. And so money might be thought of as a secondary reinforcer because it leads back to our primary needs. The reinforcement of a response by the addition or experience of a pleasurable stimulus is called positive reinforcement or reward. The reinforcement of a response by the removal, escape from, or avoidance of an unpleasant stimulus is called a negative reinforcement. A way to remember this is all reinforcements are things that you want, but positive means it's the addition of something you want, whereas negative reinforcement is not necessarily bad. It just means the removal of something that is then reinforcing. This is a bit confusing for people because people think of negative reinforcement as the same thing as a punishment, but that's actually not the same thing. Reinforcement is good, punishment is bad. A negative reinforcement simply means the removal of something that is then reinforcing. So, for example, when you wake up in the morning and you hear the alarm clock go off, you're going to get out of bed or you're going to hit your alarm clock so that the alarm goes off. That is reinforcing because you are taking away the sound of that alarm. Another example of this might be if you are hearing a loud siren go off, okay, and then you want to turn the alarm off. Well, that is reinforcing, but it's because you are removing something that's negative. So it's a good thing, but it's through removal of something. That's why it's negative. Not because it's bad in the sense of negative meaning bad, but negative in the sense that it's negating something. The reinforcement of simple steps in a behavior that lead to a desired, more complex behavior is called shaping. This involves the use of operant conditioning to reward successive approximations until the desired response is obtained. So if you think about how you train a dog to roll over or sit, you're going to start with little steps, and you're going to reward those anytime the dog takes a little step in the right direction. And same thing with a young child. If you are trying to encourage behavior, even if they don't do it completely correct the first time, you might reward successful attempts so that they are working toward complete progress or until they are able to successfully do it. So let's look at some applications of operant conditioning in day-to-day life. Instinct drift is a tendency for an animal's behavior to revert to genetically controlled patterns. So, for example, you might reinforce a dog from not jumping up when someone comes by, but eventually they're going to forget and they're going to do what comes instinctively. And that's going back to what we talked about with extinction. Eventually, you might forget a behavior, a learned behavior, but you're going to go back to the way you would instinctively do it. And that's instinct drift. The use of operant conditioning techniques to bring about desired change in behavior is called behavioral modification. So shaping is similar in the sense that shaping is about taking progressive steps, but behavioral modification is about the overall picture of trying to change behavior through various strategies. So various types of strategies have been applied to solving real-world problems. So for example, with children, one of the strategies is giving rewards anytime a child does something successful. And so that would be a strategy of modifying behavior. Any event now let's talk about punishment. We've talked about reinforcements, but the opposite of this would be punishment. So any event or object that when following a response makes a response less likely to happen again is said to be punishment. And typically punishment only temporarily suppresses the response. So again, punishment is the opposite of reinforcement because reinforcements increase the likelihood of something happening again, whereas punishment is said to decrease something from happening again. Now, there's also such a thing as a schedule of how things are reinforced. So how things are reinforced can have an effect on how successful that reinforcement works. The timing of partial reinforcement is referred to as a schedule of reinforcement. And there's different types of schedules. You can do continuous reinforcement or you can do more intermittent types of reinforcement. The reinforcement of each and every correct response is called continuous reinforcement. And this occurs when a reinforcer is presented after every response. A partial reinforcement occurs when a reinforcer is given after some but not all of the correct responses. So for example, if you were to reward anytime a child does a chore, then that would be continuous reinforcement. What is the downside of this though? Well, the downside of that is that a child may only do the chore when they're given a reward. So partial reinforcements are actually more successful, more effective, because then people learn to do the behavior for the inherent reward of the behavior itself and not necessarily just for the reinforcer. And so partial reinforcements encourage people to internalize that motivation faster. Otherwise, people just look for the extrinsic reward. Okay, so we've talked about classical and operant conditioning, but this all applies to behavioral approaches to learning. But another way we also learn is through learning about cognition. So this brings us to the subject of cognitive learning theory. Cognitive learning theory is focused on the mental processes that occur during learning. Okay, so if you think about how we learn in a class, and how we retain information, that's where cognitive learning theories come in. Latent learning is a form of learning or retention of knowledge that occurs without any apparent reinforcement or motivation. So all of us will learn information latently. We just naturally are going to learn some things as we grow. However, many of us will also require some incentives to learn cognitions. However, the reason why cognitive learning theories come about is because behavioral learning, conditioning, doesn't account for all forms of how we attain or acquire information or why we would want to. So behavioral learning theories only go so far, and therefore we also need a cognitive theory as well. Now, Kohler developed this idea of insight. And this says that, and so he used this an experiment that involved smart chimpanzees, who learned how to solve a problem, not through successive iterations or trial and error, but simply through insight. They looked at a problem and they they solved the problem just through a flash of insight. Insight literally means something coming into sight, essentially. That's why the word is insight. It means that the solution comes suddenly into sight. And so this is not explained by behavioral learning theories. It's a matter of we have the intellectual capacity to analyze things and solve problems. Related to operant conditioning is the idea that we can actually feel powerless sometimes to change the results of our actions. And so that's where Martin Seligman discovered this idea of learned helplessness. He was doing some experiments with dogs where dogs were reinforced for their behavior by removing electrical shocks. So as you recall, there is that negative reinforcement. And so the dogs that had the electrical shocks removed, they were reinforced in their behavior of avoiding or escaping from electrical shock. However, those dogs that were not able to escape from the electrical shocks, they actually just lay down and whined whenever there was an electrical shock. That's because they learned that they had no control over their situation. They just became depressed. And so this is the idea of learned helplessness. This is a tendency to fail to act to escape from a situation because of a history of repeated failures in the past. So even when they were free to move, they would just not move because they thought they couldn't do anything. And so this might explain why sometimes adults stay in abusive relationships, or why people take on a victim mentality rather than seeing the power that they have. Because of this idea of learned helplessness. When you feel like you have no power over your situation, you start to take that on. And this may explain why some people are depressed in their relationships, because they feel like they have no voice or power to change their situation. So let's talk about observational learning. This is also related to operant learning in the sense that it's about social reinforcement, and except that this is a subset. This is about learning new behavior by watching someone else perform that behavior. This is known as observational learning, and this was discovered by Albert Bandura. This is related to operant conditioning in the sense that the belief is that people are socially reinforced by fitting in with their peers. But the idea here, specific to observational learning, is that we can learn things simply just by watching other people be reinforced in their behavior. So Albert Bandura conducted the Bobo doll experiment, which involves a big bouncing doll, and which children could be aggressive toward. Now, they're divided into two groups. There was a control group and a group that had an older adult that acted violently at it. So in the group with the older adult, that person would beat on the doll, and what was found is that the young children would also get aggressive because they saw the older adult doing the same thing. Now in the other group, where there was no violent person, the children acted normally and played normally, and they did not beat on the doll. So this showed that children who were exposed to aggression were more likely to pursue physically aggressive behavior than those who were not exposed to the aggressive person. This has a lot of implications for why people may become aggressive or violent because of media or violent video games. If we've been exposed to watching violence in the media or video games, we're more likely to be susceptible to that kind of modeling because we've seen other people do it. Now, Bandura argued that there's 4 elements that were needed for observational learning to occur. First of all, you have to be paying attention to this. If it's something that you have not been focusing on, that's not likely to affect you. The other thing is it has to be something that sticks in your memory. And then you have to have a desire, you have to be able to imitate. And so this involves the development of your mirror neurons because the mirror neurons are involved in imitation. And that happens early on as children are mimicking the behavior of adults. This is also particularly important for empathy because we need our mirror neurons to help us take on the role of others. And when we take on the role of others in our mind, then we start to empathize with them. And the last factor is the element of desire. We have to want to do this behavior. Otherwise, it's not something we will learn simply through observation. I hope that all was helpful. It's a quick chapter on understanding behavioral learning. And I hope you'll join us for the next chapter as we talk about understanding what drives us. We'll be talking specifically about the subject of motivation. Thank you.